In the summer of 1864, a young 19-year-old woman named Fanny Kelly found herself thrust into a life she could never have imagined. While traveling westward to the promised lands of Idaho, her wagon train was ambushed by the Lakota, one of the most formidable and organized tribes of the Great Plains. The men were killed mercilessly, and the women and children were taken as captives. For 6 harrowing months, Fanny lived among the Lakota, enduring the challenges of survival in a world governed by different rules, values, and customs. Fanny's story is one of resilience and adaptation. Her remarkable ability to endure hardship allowed her to later recount her experience in vivid detail, creating one of the most gripping accounts of frontier survival. But her tale is more than just about survival. It's a window into the complex, often misunderstood relationship between settlers and native tribes during a time of profound upheaval. The journey began in May 1864 when a small wagon train set out along the Oregon Trail. Fanny had just married Josiah Kelly, a former Union soldier turned farmer. Josiah, 15 years her senior, had been drawn to Fanny's charm and beauty. His health, weakened by years of war and hard labor, made him hope that the climate of Idaho might bring healing and renewal. Traveling with them was Mary, their 7-year-old adopted daughter and Fanny's niece, who had been orphaned after her parents' death. Mary's innocence and golden hair symbolized everything pure and worth protecting in Fanny's eyes. The wagon train itself was small, consisting of fewer than a dozen people, including 2 black servants, Frank and Andy, and the Larimore family, William, Sarah, and their 8-year-old son. Though they were leaving the safety of the eastern settlements far behind, the group felt little fear of native attacks. Many settlers at the time underestimated the tensions building on the plains, believing that peace agreements and nearby military outposts like Fort Laramie would guarantee safe passage. Yet they were venturing deep into lands sacred to the Lakota, a powerful and resourceful people who had been watching their world change under the encroachment of settlers. Mary, unlike the others in her wagon train, carried a deep, unshakable unease about the native people she had seen at trading posts. To her young mind, their expressions seemed guarded, their smiles fleeting, as though concealing intentions that would surface under different circumstances. Her fears were fueled by the chilling stories whispered among white children in the 1860s, tales that painted Native Americans as fearsome figures, clad in feathered headdresses, raiding wagon trains, and embodying the monsters of their imaginations. This fear was not born in a vacuum. It reflected the growing tension and mistrust of the time. The party was well aware they were venturing into the homeland of the Lakota, one of the most formidable native nations on the plains. Known for their organization and mastery of horseback warfare, the Lakota comprised several bands of mobile warriors whose territories were sacred and vital to their way of life. Fanny Kelly, seeking to calm Mary's fears, assured her that they would remain safe. Settlers traveling these routes often took solace in the presence of nearby ranches, trading posts, and the soldiers stationed at Fort Laramie. Agreements between settlers and native leaders were believed to provide a fragile peace, promising unimpeded passage through the vast territories of the West. On July 12, 1864, the wagon train crossed Little Box Elder Creek under a brilliant summer sky, its glow casting an almost serene warmth over the endless expanse of the Black Hills. That evening, the travelers sang Ho for Idaho in unison, their voices rising with hope as the sun dipped below the horizon. But their optimism was short-lived. As they looked ahead, their eyes fell upon a scene that brought the singing to an abrupt halt. Hundreds of Lakota warriors, their bodies painted for battle, mounted on horseback, stood still like statues atop the distant bluff. The tranquility of the plains was shattered, replaced by an overwhelming tension that signaled their journey was about to take a darker turn. At first, the Lakota warriors remained still, perched atop a bluff, with the vast prairie stretching out beneath them. Fanny Kelly estimated their numbers at nearly 200, a formidable sight. The warriors, mounted on powerful horses, stood as an immovable wall, observing the wagon train below. Moments later, the war party began to descend with deliberate, unhurried movements. Josiah Kelly, a veteran of war, immediately commanded the small party to form their wagons into a defensive ring, preparing what little they had to defend against such overwhelming odds. The Lakota stopped just beyond the perimeter, maintaining a safe distance. Their presence was both commanding and unnerving. The warriors began to whoop and fire their guns into the air, their voices echoing across the plains. This display wasn't an attack, it was a message, one steeped in tradition and power. For the Lakota, such demonstrations were not only meant to intimidate, but also to assert dominance and test the settlers' response. Inside the wagon circle, Fanny clutched Mary tightly as the child trembled. Fanny pleaded with Josiah, urging him to keep his rifle down. "If you fire one shot, they will massacre all of us." Josiah, a man of action, loathed standing idly by, but he understood the truth in his wife's words. Outnumbered nearly 20-1, their survival depended on restraint. After several tense minutes, the gunfire ceased, and a hush fell over the prairie. The warriors stood silent, watching. From their ranks, a single figure emerged, a dignified elder riding steadily forward. Josiah left Fanny and stepped out to meet the man. The elder introduced himself as Chief Ottawa, leader of an Oglala Lakota band connected to great names like Sitting Bull, Red Cloud, and Crazy Horse. Speaking in broken English, he tapped his chest and said, "Good Indian, me." Chief Ottawa extended his hand in a gesture of peace. He explained that his war party had stumbled upon the wagon train while hunting buffalo and deer, not seeking war. Though his words and actions were seemingly kind, Fanny, with Mary still in her arms, remained uneasy. As Josiah cautiously shook Ottawa's hand, the rest of the warriors surged forward, entering the wagon circle. What had begun as a display of goodwill shifted into something more ominous. The 200 Lakota warriors enveloped the small train, moving methodically through the group. They smiled, exchanged pleasantries, and made handshakes, but their eyes roamed the wagons like hunters assessing their prey. Fanny could feel Mary's growing fear, her small body trembling as she clung tightly to her. Mary's expression mirrored the unease she had shown before when encountering Native Americans at trading posts, her intuition unshaken. Chief Ottawa proposed a trade, gesturing toward the supplies in the wagons. Josiah, desperate to maintain peace, agreed without hesitation. While the exchange began, the Kellys could see the warriors continuing to survey the wagons, their sharp eyes searching for threats, resources, and opportunities. The uneasy trade between the pioneers and the Lakota quickly began to unravel. What started as a delicate negotiation escalated into brazen demands. Josiah Kelly, determined to keep the peace, sacrificed dearly in the name of appeasement. He even traded his prized horse, a symbol of his resilience and pride. Yet, with every concession, it became clear that the Lakota were not content. Josiah's strategy was not simply submission, it was survival. His goal was to stall, knowing that every moment they delayed increased the chance of encountering another wagon train or military patrol along the heavily traveled Oregon Trail. Even a small convoy could potentially dissuade the Lakota, who historically favored engagements where they held the advantage. But the facade of peace was broken when one of the warriors reached for Josiah's gun. With a sharp motion, Josiah pulled it back and firmly told the warrior, no. The tension was palpable. This confrontation confirmed Josiah's growing suspicion. This was no mere trade party. Violence seemed inevitable, but Chief Ottawa intervened just in time. His commanding presence calmed the brewing storm as he ordered the pioneers to move on, declaring the trading done. Warily, Josiah, Fanny, Mary, and the rest of the party reorganized their wagons and continued their journey, but the Lakota were far from finished. Warriors lingered among the wagons, their movements calculated, their presence an unspoken threat. Soon, the group approached a narrow valley surrounded by towering rocks, a natural choke point that set off every alarm in Josiah's mind. He halted the wagons. The location was perfect for an ambush, and Josiah suspected that this was precisely why the Lakota had steered them here. When the pioneers refused to proceed further, tension surged again. The Lakota, sensing resistance, shifted tactics. Rather than press forward aggressively, they proposed a meal together, a tradition that could signify peace or serve as a diversion. Reluctantly, Josiah agreed. To refuse would risk escalating the already precarious situation. As the pioneers prepared provisions, Josiah and Andy, one of the servants, ventured into the forest to collect firewood. Others from the group spread out to gather supplies. In their haste, they made a fatal error. They became scattered and isolated, their unity fractured in the face of danger. The Lakota warriors, still observing, would have recognized this vulnerability immediately. Fanny, clutching Mary, described what happened next in her harrowing account, a moment when survival teetered on the edge of disaster. Then, without warning, the delicate facade of peace shattered, revealing the true intentions of the Lakota warriors. The pioneers barely had time to react before the air erupted with gunfire, arrows, and war cries. The Lakota descended upon the wagon train with unrelenting force. A single gunshot broke the uneasy silence, and one of the travelers fell lifeless to the ground, his body crumpling in the dust. Chaos engulfed the camp as the Lakota overwhelmed the few defenders. Frank, one of the black servants, tried valiantly to protect Fanny, but he fell at her feet, his body pierced by arrows. The warriors moved swiftly, cutting down the men and turning their attention to the wagons, leaving destruction in their wake. Smoke from gunpowder mingled with the acrid scent of blood, clouding the scene in a haze of carnage. Josiah and Andy, hearing the commotion, raced toward the site of the attack. From a distance they could see the destruction unfolding, warriors ransacking wagons, bodies strewn across the ground, and the air thick with war cries. Josiah's heart sank as he realized the futility of resistance. He knew well that the Lakota often spared women and children, but men were rarely shown mercy. To stay would be to die, and his only hope was that Fanny and Mary might survive as captives. The Lakota raided the wagons with ruthless efficiency, smashing chests with tomahawks and scattering flour into the dirt, prioritizing plunder over preservation. Heirlooms, priceless items carried across the plains as symbols of family heritage, were either stolen or destroyed. Fanny, holding Mary close, stood frozen, her heart racing. She prayed that remaining still and non-threatening might buy them time, perhaps even their lives. But the warriors' attention soon turned to her. Seeing this, Fanny, in desperation, ran to Chief Ottawa, pleading for protection. Ottawa, stoic and unmoved, silenced her with a gesture, resting his hand on his revolver as a clear warning. Her pleas, for the moment, seemed to fall on deaf ears. The attack continued as Ottawa's warriors systematically stripped the camp of its resources. Sarah Larimore and her young son were brought to join Fanny and Mary. Sarah, distraught over the attack and the disappearance of her husband, began wailing uncontrollably. Her cries drew Ottawa's ire. Stepping forward, he pointed a knife at her, his expression calm but commanding. His message was clear. Silence was the only option. Sarah, trembling, understood and fell quiet. Fanny seized the moment to beg Ottawa once more for protection. This time the chief hesitated. Amid the destruction and chaos, he stood silent, his expression unreadable. Then, with deliberate care, he placed a wreath of feathers on Fanny's head, a token of protection that she would later understand as a significant gesture. As the raid drew to a close, the warriors regrouped. The men of the party had either been killed or fled. The wagons, once filled with the dreams and possessions of the pioneers, were reduced to ashes and broken remnants. Fanny and Mary clung to each other as prisoners of the Lakota, their lives now irrevocably changed, leaving behind the wreckage and the lifeless bodies of their companions. Fanny Kelly and the other captives were forced onto the backs of horses, their fate now tied to the Lakota warriors. Fanny and her adopted daughter Mary shared a horse, while Mrs. Larimore and her son were placed on another. The two families, already fragile from the attack, were soon separated, adding another layer of despair to their ordeal. Despite the chaos, Fanny managed to retain a few of her possessions, an unusual blessing for a captive. Among her belongings were a fine pair of shoes, a few sets of clothing, over $100 in paper money tucked into her pockets, and a couple of books and letters. These items became her tools for survival. Unlike Mrs. Larimore, who had succumbed to hopelessness, Fanny clung to faith in her husband, Josiah. She believed he would follow their trail and bring help. 36. Determined to leave traces for her husband, Fanny tore pages from her books and discreetly scattered them along their route, like breadcrumbs leading back to her. The Lakota war party, following their well-practiced strategy, continued north into the night. They moved swiftly, knowing that staying too long in one place after a raid invited retaliation. A successful raid for the Lakota was one that inflicted maximum damage and claimed plunder without losses of their own. The warm summer day had given way to a cool, dark night. Above them, stars glittered against the vast sky, while the dense forest surrounded them in shadows. But the night was far from silent. The warriors chanted haunting war songs as they navigated creeks and treacherous gorges, their voices reverberating through the wilderness. Though the riders were nearby, the cover of darkness provided Fanny with a desperate idea. She whispered to Mary, trying to steady her trembling voice. "Mary, we're only a few miles from our camp. I've dropped letters along the way. They'll guide you back. Drop gently to the ground and hide for a little while. Then retrace your steps. If I can, I'll follow you." Wrapping Mary in her shawl against the night's chill, Fanny stroked the child's fair hair, her lips moving in silent prayer. Mary's face betrayed her fear, but she nodded. When the riders drifted just far enough, Fanny helped her daughter slip from the horse and watched as the 7-year-old vanished into the brush. The warriors didn't notice. Mary was free, but Fanny's hope of escaping alongside her daughter faded quickly. For the next hour, she searched desperately for her own opportunity to dismount, knowing that the farther they rode, the slimmer her chances of rescue became. Finally, in the cover of night, she made a clumsy attempt to slip from the horse. The Lakota were immediately upon her. Their sharp eyes had noticed more than just her escape. They realized Mary was gone. The warriors beat Fanny relentlessly, demanding to know where the child had gone. Fanny, through the pain, lied. She claimed that Mary had fallen asleep and accidentally slipped from the horse, and that her own dismount was merely an attempt to find her. The explanation didn't convince them, and the punishment continued. They warned her that any further attempts to escape would result in even harsher consequences. With dawn approaching, the warriors declared they would search for Mary in the morning. For Fanny, the physical pain of the beatings was dwarfed by the anguish of uncertainty. Whether Mary would remain hidden or whether she would be recaptured was a torment she would carry as they continued their journey. After hours of relentless travel, the Lakota war party finally stopped for the night, confident they were far enough from danger to rest. Fanny Kelly, guarded closely by warriors gripping tomahawks, was given no such reprieve. All night, she remained under watch, unable to attempt escape. When morning came, the warriors set out as promised to search for Mary, but Fanny was never told if they found her. She clung to the hope that her daughter had followed the trail of book pages and found refuge. Yet the uncertainty gnawed at her, an ache worse than exhaustion. At least she was no longer alone in her suffering. Sarah Larimore and her young son had rejoined her, their mutual captivity a fragile thread of shared humanity in a cruel and isolating situation. As the journey continued, now on foot, Chief Ottawa approached Fanny. Clearly favoring her over Sarah, he commanded her to carry his belongings, a bow, a gun, and a peculiar 3-foot stick she couldn't identify. The load was heavy, but Fanny dared not stop. Her thoughts remained consumed by Mary. Each rustling branch in the wind seemed like her daughter's voice calling out. Her mind replayed Mary's terrified expression as she slipped into the brush. Distracted by her grief, Fanny lost her grip on Ottawa's stick. It hit the ground and snapped in two. Panic surged through her as she quickly glanced around, expecting punishment, but none of the Lakota appeared to notice. Acting on impulse, she kicked the broken pieces off the trail and kept moving. Later that day, the group halted in a valley near Deer Creek Station in Wyoming. The warriors, vigilant as always, used heavy straps to bind Fanny, ensuring she couldn't escape. Exhausted but determined, she struggled with the straps whenever her captors weren't watching. Sarah, however, was gripped by fear. She begged Fanny not to leave her alone if she managed to free herself. But Fanny, resolute in her focus, refused to make that promise. Her thoughts were consumed with one thing: finding Mary and reuniting with Josiah. Fatigue eventually overcame her. She fell into an uneasy sleep, only to awaken the next morning to discover Sarah and her son were gone. During the night, one of the Lakota had helped them escape, leaving Fanny behind, still bound and utterly alone. As the days wore on, Fanny was forced to continue her role as Ottawa's porter, carrying his belongings as the group traveled deeper into the wilderness and further from the reach of white civilization. The journey was punishing. When the warriors stopped at a creek bed to dig for water, their efforts yielded little. Fanny, already parched, was forced to go without. The relentless sun beat down on her as she trudged forward over the barren terrain, her strength waning with each step. Yet she pushed on, unwilling to let despair claim her entirely. As darkness fell, after another grueling day of travel, the Lakota warriors lit a large fire that cast flickering shadows across the encampment. This gathering was unlike anything Fanny Kelly had witnessed before. The warriors danced and chanted with an intensity that made her fear the worst. Their whooping cries and rhythmic steps seemed to echo through the wilderness, filling her with dread about what they might do next. Suddenly the dancing stopped. Chief Ottawa stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Fanny. With a booming voice he shouted, "Chapa Chinapa!" The encampment fell silent as everyone turned to look at her. Fanny froze, unable to understand his words. Ottawa repeated the phrase, this time more forcefully. An Indian boy, Wichella, approached, mimicking a puffing motion with his lips. In that moment, the realization struck her. Ottawa was demanding his pipe. Fanny's mind raced as she tried to recall if she had carried a pipe among her assigned belongings. Her stomach sank as she remembered the 3-foot stick she had broken and discarded earlier on the trail. That must have been it. When Ottawa realized what had happened, his fury erupted. He declared that her negligence was unforgivable and ordered her execution. The warriors moved swiftly, preparing a grim punishment. They tied Fanny to a horse, intending to drag her in front of the warriors for target practice. Firebrands and hot coals were readied to startle the horse into a wild run. Fanny knelt on the ground, trembling as she watched the warriors ready their bows. She prayed desperately, her thoughts consumed by Mary and Josiah. As Ottawa approached with the rope in hand, Fanny's hands searched frantically for something, anything that might appease him. Her small books were useless, her shoes insignificant. Then she remembered the money tucked into her pockets. In a last-ditch effort, she pulled out the banknotes and scattered them before Ottawa and the surrounding warriors. She fanned out the remaining bills, totaling $120, and pleaded with them, insisting on the value of the money. Ottawa, either amused by her frantic gesture or impressed by the offering, relented. He ordered the warriors to lower their weapons and dismissed the punishment. Fanny later wrote that the relief was so overwhelming she fainted on the spot. When she awoke, the horse, firebrands, and weapons had all been removed, but she remained closely guarded. She had narrowly escaped death once again. As the group continued their journey, they neared a Lakota village. Fanny knew that new dangers awaited her there, and her survival would demand even more strength and resourcefulness than she had already shown. Despite her life being spared, Fanny Kelly lived in constant fear, her fate tethered to Chief Ottawa's volatile will. He often reminded her that her survival depended entirely on him. Danger felt omnipresent, a shadow that loomed over every moment of her captivity. As the group neared the Powder River, a small act of kindness sparked tension among the warriors. Ottawa's brother-in-law, noticing Fanny's worn state, gave her a pair of fresh stockings. What may have been an attempt at compassion was perceived by Ottawa as an affront to his authority. The disagreement escalated quickly, with Ottawa angrily firing his gun at his brother-in-law's horse. Humiliated and unable to retaliate against Ottawa directly, the brother-in-law turned his anger toward Fanny. Drawing his bow, he aimed an arrow at her chest. Just as the situation seemed to turn fatal, a young Lakota warrior intervened. He leapt forward, grabbed the bow, and tossed Fanny to the ground, diffusing the hostility. This warrior, called Jumping Bear, or Charging Bear, was not Oglala like Ottawa. He was from the Blackfoot, another band within the Lakota. His presence and decisive action averted further violence. Jumping Bear's background was unique. He had been baptized as a child by a Jesuit priest, and perhaps this exposure to Christian teachings informed his empathy. From that moment on, he became a protector for Fanny, often riding alongside her during their journey, a rare act for a male warrior, signaling a personal interest. His kindness stood in stark contrast to the hostility she had endured, though his romantic interest in her created another layer of complexity. After weeks of travel, the war party reached the outskirts of the Lakota village. In preparation for their triumphant return, they paused to adorn themselves and their horses. Victorious war parties often treated their arrival as a form of theater, donning war paint and displaying the spoils of their raid. Fanny observed with a heavy heart as warriors proudly wore the clothes of her wagon-train companions. One warrior donned her silk gloves alongside a mismatched breechcloth and hat, a sight that felt both surreal and disheartening. As they entered the massive village, Fanny was struck by its scale and energy. Stretching for miles, the village was alive with dance, song, and celebration. Yet amidst the chaos, she was separated from Jumping Bear, her only source of comfort. Alone and vulnerable, she was led to Ottawa's lodge, where his 6 wives waited to receive him. Fanny hoped the women would show her kindness, but their wary gazes and crossed arms dashed her hopes. She later wrote, "I had so hoped to find sympathy and pity among these women of the forest, but instead I sat cowed and trembling, scarcely daring to breathe." Ottawa entered the lodge, displaying the treasures he had seized during the raid. His wives immediately began to argue over the spoils, with the eldest pulling a knife and declaring herself the final arbiter. The chief watched with amusement before departing for a feast, leaving Fanny to navigate her position among the hostile women. As Fanny distanced herself from the others, she noticed women and children gathering to gawk at her. Captives were a rarity, and her presence drew attention. What struck Fanny most were the fair-skinned children among the tribe. One of the wives, speaking broken English, explained that these children were the result of fort marriages. Women from tribes would engage with soldiers stationed at forts like Fort Laramie, receiving goods and protection in exchange for companionship. These unions often ended when the soldiers' legal wives arrived, leaving the women and their mixed-race children behind. The pale-skinned children, mocked for their appearance, became a stark symbol of the cultural entanglements and tragedies of the frontier. Over time, some members of the village began to show Fanny kindness. They brought her food, treated her wounds, and helped her adapt. Yet her heart remained heavy when Ottawa presented her with a young child, Yellowbird, whom he declared to be her new daughter. Yellowbird, with her innocent eyes and trusting demeanor, was meant to replace Mary in Fanny's life. But for Fanny, she was only a painful reminder of the child she had lost. The memory of Mary haunted her sleepless nights, her small figure vanishing into the darkness as Fanny whispered her final prayer and draped her shawl over her fair hair. Yellowbird approached Fanny with quiet trust, her small gestures bridging the divide between captor and captive. Despite her grief, Fanny tried her best to care for the child, embracing the role of a mother figure. The elder wife, whose fiery temper Fanny had once feared, showed unexpected kindness. She shared tea with Fanny, encouraging her to rest. Though harsh at times, the elder wife had grown protective of her, recognizing the vulnerability behind Fanny's stoic facade. That night, Fanny and Yellowbird curled up in the tent. For the first time since her capture, Fanny felt a semblance of peace, managing to sleep soundly. Yet the calm was fleeting. Fanny's temporary reprieve in the village was about to end, as the Lakota prepared for war with the United States. In late July, Fanny was brought to a tribal feast. To her surprise, she was seated in an elevated position, a place of prominence that carried unsettling implications. The warriors watched her intently as the gathering unfolded. Scalps, symbols of triumph in battle, hung from poles around her, a stark reminder of the realities of war. Although she couldn't understand the speeches, the intensity of the Lakota chants and dances made their intent unmistakable. The village was preparing to confront General Fort Sully, who had been pursuing the Lakota across the plains. The following morning, the village awoke in motion. The elderly, women and children worked quickly to dismantle their homes, lowering tent poles and rolling up animal skins used for bedding and shelter. Supplies were loaded onto horses, and travois dragged by dogs, ensuring the village could move to a safer location while the warriors prepared for battle. Fanny, like the others, joined on horseback, observing the methodical precision of the evacuation. 3 days later, the warriors returned, triumphant and jubilant. Their belts were adorned with fresh scalps, and their demeanor spoke of victory. Though Fanny didn't know the specifics of the battle, the celebrations left no doubt that the Lakota had gained the upper hand. As part of the spectacle, Fanny was painted, and made to carry the staff bearing their war trophies. The ensuing celebration was both mesmerizing and terrifying. The warriors formed a circle, brandishing their weapons and performing a coordinated dance. Fanny later described the scene. They stamped in unison, leaping with sharp, synchronized movements, their weapons slicing through the air. Their war cries pierced the night, echoing like a chorus of demons. The intensity of their gestures, as if enacting the act of battle itself, filled her with dread. While Fanny still viewed them as her captors, this moment deepened her understanding of the Lakota's motivations. She began to grasp the anger and sorrow behind their resistance. The women, particularly those with pale-skinned children from fort marriages, bore their own burdens. These children, born from unions with white soldiers, were often teased and ostracized by the full-blooded Lakota. Beyond personal grievances, the collective fury of the Lakota stemmed from the profound changes settlers had imposed on their land. The wagons of settlers like Fanny carved trails through sacred territories without permission. Forests were cut, buffalo slaughtered, and the very foundation of the Lakota's way of life eroded under the demands of white governance. Even those who accepted annuities and rations from the U.S. government were not spared, often punished for the actions of unrelated tribes. In turn, the Lakota retaliated where they could, defending their homeland with ferocity. Fanny saw the beauty of their land, vast, fertile, and alive with buffalo and elk. She understood why they fought so fiercely to protect it. Yet, despite her growing comprehension, her perspective remained colored by her suffering. To her, the Lakota were captors and killers, responsible for the destruction of her life. She prayed for freedom and escape, longing for the day she could leave this world behind. This time, the Lakota War Party had emerged victorious, but Fanny Kelly could only hope their successes would not continue indefinitely. However, the tides of war shifted quickly. On August 8th, the Lakota were forced onto the defensive. This time they were not the hunters, they were the hunted. General Fort Sully, seeking revenge for their last encounter, had assembled a powerful force to track and confront them. The scale of Sully's pursuit was overwhelming. His troops were well equipped, bolstered by artillery, which was a devastating advantage on the plains. The Lakota village retreated with urgency, fleeing deeper into their territory to escape the advancing soldiers. By sundown, the group reached the banks of the Missouri River. The journey had been grueling. The heat of the August sun left them dehydrated and sunburned, including Fanny, who prayed for deliverance. She longed to see Sully's forces, hoping they had found Mary and knew she was still alive. Fanny's thoughts spiraled with desperation. If only she could catch sight of the soldiers, she might gauge how close they were. Maybe, just maybe, she could escape and reach them. Yet, the Lakota forbade her from even turning her head during the retreat. The fear of punishment loomed large, and Fanny could do little but follow and pray. By the next day, the aftermath of Sully's relentless pursuit was clear. Wounded Lakota warriors were brought into the camp, their injuries a grim testament to the battle. Despite her status as a captive, Fanny was ordered to assist in tending to their wounds. To her surprise, she proved adept at it. In the chaos of war, her efforts were a small but notable moment of resilience. The Lakota fled deeper into the Badlands, a rugged and barren expanse of land that offered natural protection but little comfort. They hoped the harsh terrain would dissuade General Fort Sully from continuing his relentless pursuit. Yet Sully, resolute in his mission, would later boast of his determination to deliver what he described as one of the most severe punishments that the Indians had ever received. His forces pressed on, undeterred by the challenges of the landscape. The tribe, recognizing the urgency of their flight, abandoned anything that slowed them down. Lodges, clothing, tools, blankets, once essential for survival, were discarded along the way. Even their horses, exhausted from the grueling pace, were driven harder, beaten to push them beyond their limits. As they crossed the Yellowstone River, there was a flicker of hope that they might have finally escaped Sully's grasp. But when the warriors returned to retrieve the supplies they had left behind, they found only ashes. Sully's troops had destroyed everything, burning the abandoned items to deny the Lakota any chance of recovery. The tribe, already weary and hungry, was left demoralized. For Fanny Kelly, hope of rescue faded further. If Sully's forces knew she was alive, there was no sign they were coming for her. The mood in the Lakota camp turned somber. The warriors who survived the battle returned to the village, bearing the weight of their losses. The entire tribe entered a period of mourning for the dead, their grief expressed through deeply rooted cultural practices. Fanny wrote of the scene, describing how the warriors inflicted gashes an inch in length in their bodies and limbs. Some cut off their hair, blackened their faces, and marched through the village in procession, wailing and torturing their bodies. This mourning was not merely an expression of sorrow, but a profound cultural ritual, a way for the Lakota to honor the fallen and channel their collective grief. The self-inflicted wounds and acts of mourning symbolize the depth of their loss and the resilience of their spirit in the face of immense hardship. In the wake of General Sully's relentless campaign, the Lakota's grief and frustration boiled over, and Fanny Kelly became a visible target for their anger. The chiefs, including Ottawa, called her to council. At the center of the gathered circle, a stake had been driven into the ground, surrounded by sticks and kindling, a chilling symbol of the decision they faced. As the pipe was passed, several chiefs voiced their desire for vengeance. They argued that justice for their losses could only be achieved through the destruction of the whites, including Fanny. The debate centered on whether she should be burned alive as retribution for the suffering Sully had inflicted on their people. Ottawa, however, did not join in their condemnation. Rising to speak, he appealed to their sense of fairness. While he acknowledged their right to vengeance, he argued that Fanny herself bore no guilt for the actions of her people. He spoke of her kindness and the affection their children held for her, painting her as a sister rather than an enemy. His words swayed the council, and the decision to execute Fanny was abandoned. Though she left the council alive, Fanny's trials were far from over. The tribe, having abandoned most of their supplies during Sully's pursuit, faced a harsh famine. With little food, even the dogs and horses succumbed to starvation, their emaciated bodies consumed out of necessity. The Badlands yielded little game, and what little food was found was rationed sparingly. Fanny, as an outsider, was often denied even these meager portions, resorting to eating grass to survive. The hunger affected everyone, including Ottawa's elder wife. Once a source of reluctant kindness, the woman became increasingly impatient and hostile. Yet, amidst the scarcity, another woman took pity on Fanny and shared meat from her husband's hunt. This act of compassion sparked the elder wife's rage. Fueled by jealousy and desperation, she drew her knife, vowing to kill Fanny. Fanny fled in terror, seeking refuge with Ottawa. He stepped in to shield her, but the elder wife's fury knew no bounds. In her blind rage, she stabbed Ottawa multiple times. The commotion escalated when another warrior, assuming Fanny was the cause of the chaos, fired his revolver at her. The shots missed Fanny, but one struck Ottawa, lodging a bullet in his arm. The situation spiraled into confusion, but Fanny's life was spared. The warriors brought her to Ottawa's tent, where he lay bleeding and gravely injured. She was tasked with dressing his wounds. The elder wife disappeared, and though Fanny wondered about her fate, she never asked. Over the following weeks, Fanny's role shifted. She became Ottawa's caretaker, tending to him as he worked to rebuild the strength of the Lakota. Severely weakened by his injuries, Ottawa sought to forge alliances to counter Sully's forces. His plan included marrying the daughter of another chief, hoping the union would unify their bands and bolster their resistance. Fanny watched as Ottawa repurposed her belongings, including her shoes, which he offered as a gift to his new bride. It was a surreal reminder of how her former possessions, looted from her life, were now symbols of power and exchange among her captors. As the Lakota moved through the Badlands, new warriors joined Ottawa's band. Among them was a man whose presence horrified Fanny. Riding beside her, he said nothing, but she noticed a familiar shawl tied to his side. It was the shawl she had wrapped around Mary, her daughter, on the night she had dropped her from the horse, praying for her escape. Next to the shawl hung a small scalp with golden hair. The sight broke Fanny completely. She fell from her horse, collapsing to the ground in despair. Her mind reeled as she later wrote, "My eyes rested on the frightful sight. I trembled in my saddle and grasped the air for support. A blood-red cloud seemed to come between me and the outer world. In that moment, Fanny understood the cruel meaning behind Ottawa's gift of Yellowbird and his words about replacing what had been lost. Overcome with grief, she begged the warriors to kill her, unable to fathom continuing. They refused and left her there, her body alive, but her spirit shattered. It would take a long time before Fanny felt any semblance of normalcy again. Weeks of despair and uncertainty weighed heavily on Fanny Kelly when an unexpected visitor arrived in the Lakota village. His name was Porcupine, and he cut a striking figure, well-dressed and mounted on a fine horse. Fanny immediately noticed his distinguished appearance, though he did not speak to her upon his arrival. Days later, he approached her with something that ignited a fragile spark of hope, a letter from Captain Marshall of the 11th Cavalry. The letter revealed that the U.S. military was aware of Fanny's survival and had made multiple attempts to secure her freedom. Porcupine, identified as a friendly Indian, had been sent as a trusted intermediary to escort her back. As a reward, the military had provided him with provisions, fine clothing, and the very horse he rode into the village. The letter further assured Fanny that Porcupine could be trusted, as hostages, including his 3 wives, were being held at the fort to ensure his cooperation. At first, this glimmer of rescue filled Fanny with relief, but her hope was short-lived. After delivering the letter, Porcupine revealed his true intentions. He had no plans to fulfill his agreement with the soldiers. Instead, he declared that he would stand with the Lakota in their fight against the whites. His allegiance had shifted, and he felt no obligation to the promises he had made to the U.S. military. Fanny, desperate, pleaded with Porcupine to honor his word. She reminded him of the hostages held at the fort, including his wives. But Porcupine laughed, dismissing her pleas. "The white soldiers are cowards," he said. "They never kill women. I will deceive them as I have done before." He coldly added that he would simply report her death to the soldiers and move on. With those words, Fanny's fragile hope was crushed. The promise of rescue slipped further out of reach, leaving her to face the grim reality of her captivity. She remained a prisoner among the Lakota, living in starvation and servitude, surrounded by those responsible for the death of her adopted daughter. She had no knowledge of her husband's fate and saw no credible path to freedom. The only solace Fanny could cling to was the knowledge that people were searching for her. Even as she endured the harshest conditions, this faint awareness of being remembered kept her spirit from breaking completely. For weeks, the Lakota remained in the desolate Badlands, battling hunger, cold, and despair. Fanny Kelly, weakened by starvation and exhaustion, narrowly escaped a prairie fire and found herself at odds with Ottawa's newest wife. Tensions ran high, but the days dragged on until an unexpected arrival changed the course of her captivity. One day, after nearly 5 months with the Lakota, a band of Blackfoot Lakota entered Ottawa's Oglala camp. They came with a specific purpose: to bargain for Fanny. The U.S. military had withheld winter supplies from local tribes, using the plight of their captive as leverage. The Blackfoot hoped to deliver Fanny to Fort Sully, appeasing the soldiers and securing critical provisions to survive the harsh season. A tense council followed, lasting 2 days. Ottawa, unwilling to part with Fanny, resisted. Yet the Blackfoot persisted, and eventually a compromise was reached. The plan was as audacious as it was horrifying. Fanny would be used as bait. The Blackfoot would present themselves as her rescuers and bring her to Fort Sully. Once inside, they would launch an ambush, slaughter the soldiers, and return her to Ottawa. For Fanny, the prospect of being used to orchestrate another bloodbath was devastating. She longed for freedom, but couldn't bear the thought of more deaths because of her. The Blackfoot left 3 horses as collateral for Fanny's return after the ambush. She traveled with 50 armed and painted warriors on a grueling 150-mile journey to the Blackfoot camp. The cold and exhaustion weighed heavily on her, but upon their arrival, a celebration awaited. The Blackfoot chief's wife assured Fanny she would be safe in their camp, warning that any mistreatment of her would be met with harsh consequences. Yet, her presence drew attention far beyond the Blackfoot. Other tribes, incentivized by U.S. rewards for returning captives, began visiting the camp, eager to negotiate for Fanny. The Blackfoot chief refused their offers, but tensions rose as Fanny became a prized possession. One night, an attempt was made to kidnap her, a stark reminder of how precarious her situation had become. Poor weather, including snowdrifts, delayed the Blackfoot's plan to move toward Fort Sully. During this time, an old protector emerged, Jumping Bear. Having heard of her captivity, he returned to the Blackfoot camp, his feelings for Fanny as steadfast as ever. Jumping Bear confessed his love, and Fanny saw a rare opportunity. She pleaded with him to prove his affection by delivering a letter to General Sully at Fort Sully. The letter warned the general of the Blackfoot's planned ambush and begged for her rescue. Fanny assured Jumping Bear that he would be rewarded for his efforts and convinced him that the letter would not harm his people. Reluctantly, he agreed and set off. Not long after Jumping Bear departed, the snow cleared and the Blackfoot resumed their journey. The 200-mile trek to Fort Sully was brutal. Malnourished and weak, Fanny knew the journey's end offered only two outcomes. Either the soldiers would be slaughtered, or Jumping Bear would deliver her letter, saving them all. On December 11, 1864, the group arrived at Fort Sully, prepared for battle. Fanny, dressed in a white cotton gown with a buffalo robe draped across her shoulders, was led forward by the chiefs. The snow-covered ground muffled every sound, casting an eerie silence over the scene. Soldiers manned the garrisons, their presence both a beacon of hope and a source of dread. Would she finally be free, or would this lead to another massacre? The chiefs advanced with Fanny, stopping at the gates of the fort. A captain, several officers, and an interpreter emerged to greet them. "Am I free? Indeed free?" Fanny whispered desperately to the captain. His quiet reply, "Yes," filled her with cautious relief. The chiefs and Fanny were escorted inside, where they were promised the rewards awaiting their bravery. However, as the remaining warriors approached the gates, the soldiers revealed their true intentions. A booming command echoed through the fort. The gates were to be closed, and the men were ordered to man the walls. The war party outside was left shut out, their chiefs now hostages. At that moment, Fanny realized that Jumping Bear had delivered her letter. After nearly 7 months of captivity, she was finally free. Shortly after her rescue, Fanny Kelly was reunited with her husband, Josiah, whose relentless search for her had never wavered. Their reunion brought a brief period of happiness, and they welcomed a son, Josiah Jr. Tragically, Josiah passed away a few years later from cholera, leaving Fanny a widow. Despite her losses, Fanny's resilience endured. In 1870, her role in preventing the raid on Fort Sully was formally recognized by President Ulysses S. Grant and Congress, who awarded her $5,000 in compensation for her ordeal and the hardships she had faced. Fanny's survival story continued to intertwine with those of others who had endured captivity. She eventually crossed paths with Sarah Larimore, another survivor of their shared nightmare. The two women initially agreed to co-author a book chronicling their experiences among the Lakota, but this collaboration turned sour. Fanny discovered that Sarah intended to publish the work as her own, sparking a plagiarism lawsuit. Fanny prevailed in court and was awarded a small sum, solidifying her claim to the narrative she had so painstakingly documented. Her account, My Captivity Among the Sioux Indians, published a few years after her rescue, became a cornerstone in the documentation of frontier survival. Through her writing, Fanny shared the harrowing details of her captivity and the cultural complexities of her time among the Lakota. Decades later, Fanny had an unexpected reunion with Jumping Bear in Washington. D.C. now married Jumping Bear introduced his wife to Fanny with humor and grace, calling her Kolamatawa, or my friend. Like many of his people, Jumping Bear had been forced to assimilate into the expanding world of the United States. Yet, he sought to turn his circumstances into an opportunity for advocacy, working to protect the rights of his people while navigating the challenges of life under a new system. Fanny lived a long and reflective life after her time with the Lakota, passing away in 1904. While she carried the memory of her young adopted daughter Mary with her until her death, Fanny remained one of the rare few to survive captivity among the Lakota and to tell her story.